Hello, sewing friends. Thanks for coming to the TurboPurr channel, where we love the sound of happy cats and smooth running sewing machines. My name is Ramona. Today I'm showing this Let's Fly quilt pattern that I pieced using the 1/4" seam on the serger using a 3-thread overlock stitch. I also used Floriani software to digitize and stitch out the airplane pieces in the hoop. In addition, some of the work on this quilt was done with a standard sewing machine stitch. This video is for entertainment purposes only. Enjoy. These are the supplies that I used to make this quilt. Um, the pattern instructions are very clearly written and illustrated. I decided that I wanted to use my 3-thread overlock stitch on the serger to do a lot of the piecing on the long straight sections of the quilt. I like piecing on the serger because it's quite accurate seam allowances, and it is also, I find that it really speeds up the process of putting the quilt together. Depending on your brand of machine, you will want to check your manual for instructions about how to get a 1/4" seam allowance or 1/4" wide stitch with your overlock settings. And you can also do a test stitch on a scrap of fabric and measure it and make sure that you have an accurate 1/4" seam allowance on your machine with the serger. This is a photo of my sewing companion, Miss Boo. These long straight seam allowances came in handy on this quilt because there's so many different sections that are all the same, all these different stripes put together. After serging each section, I use the iron to press the seam allowance toward the darker parts of the fabric. So in other words, with the white sections and the different colored sections, every seam allowance was pressed towards the colored section in order to hide the stitches. I actually was using red thread that I had in my serger because I had quite a lot of extra red thread, so I didn't want that to show through to the front. With light colored fabrics, for example, with this white, if you're using a dark colored thread and you press it towards that other side, then you run the risk of having the thread actually show through the lighter colored fabric. Hence the reason for always pressing the seam allowances toward the darker color of fabric that you are using. The airplane pieces are included in the pattern instructions. There are sheets of paper within the pattern instructions that outline each part of the airplane pieces and the seam allowances. Instructions are given for cutting out these sections and then piecing them together with a 1/4" seam allowance on a regular sewing machine. I like to use my Floriani embroidery software. I am not so good at accurately piecing small pieces together. So I opted to scan the paper pattern pieces for the airplane and save them as JPEG files. Then I went into my Floriani embroidery software and opened them up as a background picture within the software and use the Floriani digitizing tools to trace the seam lines and create straight stitches for the pattern pieces. So I outlined the gray left wing section of the as an applique, and then place that fabric down in the hoop, and the had a stitching line to stitch that gray piece down, and then had seam lines digitized to stitch and flip the section of the wing above the wing, the white section, the white triangle section, and then below the wing, the triangle section below the wing in the white fabric. I only I only digitized the left wing block section because when I got to the embroidery machine after I stitched out the 5 left wing sections for each of the 5 planes that are on the quilt, all I had to do was mirror image that section and then repeat the process with stitching out the right wing sections 5 times. The central part of the airplane is cut straight with small triangles added at the top. I didn't do that in the hoop. I just did that using the regular sewing machine, following the instructions in the pattern. And the bottom sections of the airplane, I did use the Floriani software to digitize those and stitch that out 5 times in the hoop for each of the 5 airplanes. Some people have also taken this pattern and used it for paper piecing. I really like to use my embroidery software, so that's why I decided to do that. I like to have my quilting be kind of unobtrusive when I do the quilting. I wanted to really show off the stripes in the front of the quilt. So once I put the quilt sandwich together, I stitched in the ditch between each stripe of the below the airplanes, all the different colors. I went over each seam with a slightly lengthened straight stitch, like I think I used a 3mm straight stitch to stitch in the ditch between each of those stripes that are shown on the front of the quilt. And so this is a picture of the back of the quilt, so you can clearly see the vertical stripes of the stitch in the ditch quilting. I also like to have a quilt label on each of my quilt, and I used a digitized quilting design that I had and added this label to the back of my quilt. And this is a illustration of the quilt sandwich, the top, the back batting, and the backing fabric, and the quilt binding. People like to bind their quilts in different ways. The pattern calls for cutting a 2.5-inch wide strip of binding, which is then folded in half and pressed. Some people like to stitch the binding to the front of the quilt and wrap it around and then stitch in the ditch. Um, to bind the quilt. Other people like to apply the quilt binding to the back of the quilt and wrap it around to the front and then stitch down the front edge all the way around the quilt. My preference is that I like to stitch stitch the quilt binding on to the front of the quilt, wrap it around the edge of the quilt, and then stitch in the ditch from the front of the quilt to catch all the raw edges on the back. And then after it's down, I press it. And all the corners are, of course, mitered to have those nice sharp corners on it. I used the 3-thread overlock stitch on the serger to attach the binding to all the way around the quilt. And then after that, I pressed it all the way around and then wrapped it around and used the standard sewing machine with a slightly lengthened stitch of about 3.0 to stitch in the ditch all the way around the binding. And then I also wanted to mention that on the top of the quilt, in the white area of the quilt above the airplanes, I used a very loose and open free motion stippling stitch and stitched all of that area. I did that, of course, before binding it. I really like to use free motion. I think that it's fun and it's relaxing. And once you get used to doing it, it's really quite easy. And I just like to do that because I think it's a time saver. Thank you very much for watching. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. And these are a couple more of my sewing buddies who are taking a nap. And have a wonderful day. Happy stitching.